Thank you. I think there's a question in here, but I'll start putting it as a comment and hope it ends on an up tone. It would have been interesting for you to be in Épineux this summer, Martin, because we were talking a lot about the intermittence, the intermittency of agency in this respect. And the idea for Bernard, which I think is a brilliant idea, that agency has to be created, that it has to be wrested away from a basic, in some sense, an impasse or a predisposition to impasse. But at the same time, I find myself slightly torn by that on the grounds that if you start looking at the neuroscience of agency, what differentiates humans from other great apes is the size of the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens, and something in particular which is very sophisticatedly described as the stop impulse, which is our ability to resist temptations to a far greater extent than the usual array of bonobos and lab rats. But this is something where we can very tangibly measure the difference between our natural predisposition to resist temptation. This is something that's been massively eroded over recent years. Everybody's seen the bits of film of 3-year-olds who can no longer wait 10 seconds for 2 sweets instead of taking 1 sweet after 1 second. But this is something that we know and can measure has been attacked by advertising and the usual forces of consumerism. But I kind of just put it out there as an open question that we're torn with Bernard between, on one hand, I think this brilliant notion, which has got echoes in Kittler as well, of an agency that has to be created, and the basic neuroscientific premise, which is that we have an agency that starts there, but it's very easy to obliterate.
Yeah.
So just put it out there, how is this going to serve as the dynamic around which we go on to address these questions of agency in relation to Bernard then?
Yeah, thank you. That's very difficult. I suspect that's very difficult in itself, but it's particularly difficult for me, as it were, right now. The first thing that comes to mind, Gerald, is that, it is interesting that clearly the notion, if that's what's coming from the neuroscience of, we as it were, start with a possibility of agency but define negatively. That we start from that, and then we start from that, and we can subtract from that. You can see how that's I would have thought that's fairly straightforwardly compatible with much of what Bernard says in terms of what I was describing as to use his Kantian language, that lazy, cowardly tendency to outsource, which is to say precisely not to, as it were, to refuse my stop impulse in that sense. But I guess one first question that I can see, and I don't have an answer, but I'm sure other people might have better contributions than this. But one first question, I guess, would be to think about the extent to which my stop impulses are indeed mine. And you could think that what I was describing as arriving into and as a site of potential agency might be something like arriving as a being with something like that neurological possibility. But there's a very real sense, isn't there, in all sorts of ways, that my stop impulses are not mine. They constitute a site within which something like I might emerge. So maybe that might be a bridge, conceivably. But that's the best I can do for now, I think.
Could you thanks for a wonderful paper? Could you just tell us a bit more about your use of the term non-inhuman? Is that different from human, or is it a wonderful term, by the way? But yeah, I know about the way you're working it through.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us a bit more?
I mean, it's actually interesting, isn't it? Actually, that's something that can link back to Gerald's question rather nicely. In as much as we would start with something like a non-inhuman possibility, and then we can kind of be ground down from that in one way or another. But that's where we start. I suppose. I mean, and one thing that I was aware of while I was reading that out was that I was very intermittent in my signalling of what was quotation and what wasn't, and obviously the non-inhuman was consistently in quotation marks because you all know that that's Bernard's term, obviously. But I guess one of the interesting things about it, specifically in this regard, is that it works as a way of keeping open that, or of maintaining a breach between something like agency or the will and something like a subject, which would be self-grounding in terms of that. That it's in that sense it's an estranging. It's both has references to the way that processes work, but just rhetorically, as it were, it's also an estranging term, which is refusing to think in terms of faculties and so on and so on. But
no. I suppose my interest really was, given your own work around the human. How that sort of collided with Bernard's thing, and whether because it seems to me that you've done so much work around this sort of conception of vestigial humanity and a bare sort of residue of the human, whether the intersection of that with Bernard's use of the term produced anything that you can comment on in that.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you, Ian, to ask that. One thing that does interest me in those terms is that actually, there is that thinking of the sort of line of thinking of the human that I have pursued in the past, that does rely on figures of residuality and vestigiality and so on. Also, and as you know, this is something that I've assumed as well, perfectly happily, but that does also open up the question of pathos in relation to that characterization, and the possible, as it were, in this context, in a context of a strong attempting to maintain a strong thinking of agency, then one interest for me of the non-inhuman, as opposed to the residually human or the human as exposed, would precisely be that it's not pathetic. It's it puts a marker down and says, let's start from here, as it were. But it doesn't, as far as I can tell, there's no pathos about it. And as you know, I'm not opposed to pathos, but as you also know, it gets you and has got me into some interesting discussions when it comes to the articulation of that characterization into the possibility of agency, precisely.
Yes, Martin. Just a couple of questions, because you mentioned hybrid agency in Latour, and I thought that was very interesting, and on this idea of hybridity. And you also first started with quite a strong opposition between this idea of automation and autonomy, and you said, on one hand you have automation as a kind of disaster, and autonomy, which is a value, also it refers to kind of reason, will, desire, responsibility, and sovereignty. And then you said, at the same time, hybridity sits very with difficulty with sovereignty. And I think if you use more Bataillean framework, or if you use more, even you mentioned Artaud, you could, and you were talking here about residual humanity, or non-inhumanity. I think perhaps you could not try to find a non-reactionary use of the term responsibility, a non-reactionary use of the term sovereignty. Sovereignty is a term that is used constantly in international law or constantly in politics. And I was wondering whether you could push that forward using Latour and Jane Bennett, and also Artaud, like just to make the connections between the sort of the first part and the second part clear.
Thank you. That's that's very interesting. it would be very interesting to explore the Bataillean or Artaudien dimension to this. I mean, the one thing about the Bataillean conception of sovereignty, for me, would be that it's but this could be an interesting path, I think, here, is that, you know, Bataillean sovereignty is a kind of sovereignty in ruination, and it is that it's actually, it is being in ruination that is sovereignty, as it were. And so it would be interesting to think that, and that precisely in relation to expenditure without reserve. I mean, you know, so Bataille is working with that medieval conception of the sovereign as the one who consumes but doesn't produce, and so the sovereignty is, in that sense, expenditure without reserve. And I'm not going to be able to do this now, but I would be very interested in thinking, or I'd be very interested to hear what Bernard might think about the connections between that kind of conception of sovereignty, which is to say precisely a non-utilitarian one, but it's not a conception of sovereignty that you can easily get to a notion of responsibility. Other than a kind of perverse existentialist responsibility in terms of authenticity, in terms of an authentic commitment to an ontological or existential truth. But it would be very interesting, I think, to think about that, the degree of extreme refusal of instrumentality in that Bataillean sovereignty, and whether there is a transition there to moral sovereignty here, but that is precisely being held in a non-utilitarian sense. And community. Yeah. But I don't know, I don't know, Bernard will have to tell me, but I don't know. It's partly because I haven't put them into that configuration yet, I suppose. But, and also, as I say, you know, I mean, I think Bernard's descriptions of agency and the kind of agency that he insists on us assuming do imply a kind of sovereign agency, but at the same time there is no sovereign agency for Bernard. So, you know, in a way I deliberately introduced the term of sovereignty in order to debunk it later on. But thank you very much for the Bataille reference, though, because that debunks it in a different way. But at the same time, I don't know, at the same time there is a difference. I mean, I know Bernard talks about there's interesting and important references to la part maudite for Bernard. And absolutely as in relation to otium as opposed to negotium and so on. So there are definitely connections there. But at the same time, there is something abject in Bataillean sovereign ruination that is all, if I'm going to, you know, to speak from a Bataillean perspective, you know, if you were here representing Bataille, you would have to say that that abject quality to the sovereign in Bataille is always going to slide away from any invocation of responsibility. So there's, you know, there's still a kind of cleavage there, I think. But thank you very much, Benoit. I need to think a lot more about that.
First, thank you very much for your communication. This question of sovereignty and Bataille is, for me, translated into the question of uncalculability. I believe this expression of sovereignty, it is now necessary to transform it into the question of uncalculability, what I call infinite speed, and bifurcation, if we can use this term in English. It works in English, yeah. And for trying to answer also questions pointed out by Ian James concerning the non-inhuman. I try to reopen the question of the anthropos as what I call a neganthropos today. Because I believe that now the question of the Dasein, let's say the Dasein, rather than the human, is the question of neganthropy. And here I think I didn't understand extremely well what you said, Gerald. Maybe we will discuss after the afternoon concerning your question. I could understand some parts, but not your whole question. So, nevertheless, I wanted also to answer what I perceived of your question, And in the answer of Martin, I think we need today to produce what I will talk about this in my own communication, an organology of will, an organology of volition, an organology of desire, 3 different questions, but 3 questions of what I call also the organology of pretensions. And saying that, I also a manner to answer or to continue the discussion with Antoinette concerning algorithmic governmentality, and it doesn't work. Merci. And I think what is at stake behind the non-inhuman is necessarily thought from the inhuman. The first question is the inhuman. This is also what is in the fragment by Eric Lteos. Only a non-just person can understand what is justice. You can understand what is justice only from crime, fault, if you speak with a Christianic tradition or monotheistic tradition. So today, for example, in what was at stake in the descriptions of digital or algorithmic governmentality by Antoinette Rouvois and Thomas Berns, what is interesting for me is the experience of the lack or of the loss of volition, which is induced by algorithmic governmentality. What is algorithmic governmentality? Firstly, for me, it is an automatic treatment at the speed of light of our retentions, producing pretensions, preceding us, and making us willing, not at all willing at the end, but seemingly willing to do this thing or to buy this thing, etc., etc. And there are 2 possibilities here to react with in front of this, face with this. The first one is to denounce the situation. The other one, which is much more interesting for me, is to analyze this possibility as the truth of the inhuman, that we are. We are firstly capable to answer to such an artificial production of pretensions. And it's not the algorithmic governmentality which produces that. It is what is at stake in Socrates' denunciation of sophistry, when Socrates says, these people, the sophists, are producing artificial pretensions, and this is a manipulation. But if it works, it is because we are inhabited by this originally. This is what I call also default. So this is, for speaking with Deleuze and Stoicism, a quasi-causal apprehension of the situation. It's not a Heideggerian one, but a Deleuzian one. The question is not to denounce my facticity, for example. It is to think with my facticity and to act and to answer, to respond with my, from this or for this facticity.
Would you say a quick word? Yeah, it will be very brief. In relation to that, I mean, there's one very quick and easy way of characterizing the difference between, let's say, Bataille's time, so up to the start of the 1960s, and now, but particularly, let's say, Bataille up to and including the 1940s, is that what Bataille finds around him, if you like, culturally, politically, socially, and philosophically, is that there is precisely too much will and too much projection. And so the stakes for Bataille are to ruin that. And obviously, as we all know, in a sense, our situation couldn't be more different from that. But thank you, Bernard, for reminding us of the link to the incalculable, because I think one thing that does mean actually is that as it were, the quasi-anthropological bataille is probably the least useful bataille for us now, and it's actually the bataille of la Parmodite who is the most useful, and still in a position to resonate with that situation.